we go. Since we do short story contests every month, and next month the short story contest for the summer is due, I figured today would be a good time to talk about short stories and tips and tricks for improving writing short stories. Now, your short story doesn't have to be perfect. It never is. That's not what I'm saying here. These are just things that you might want to look out for, even in your second draft. Honestly, I highly recommend don't edit your first draft. Don't really worry about it until you're finished. When you finish your first draft, then go back and edit and worry about all these types of things. These are just things to worry about in post. These are not things that you have to worry about right now. These are just things to help you after. Now, why do I say that? Because sometimes I think things like this can get a little overwhelming and your brain goes, but what if I don't? Don't worry about if you don't. You can fix it later. You're not going, most of you, some of you may, but most of you are probably going to finish it before the deadline and look at it before the deadline. Now, some people finish it the midnight before and then immediately turn it in. That's fine. I've definitely been there. I've definitely done that myself. As a writer and as an editor, I've definitely had clients of mine be like, so I know I said I'd get it to you by Thursday, but... So I get it. We as writers sometimes procrastinate to the very last minute. If you don't, great. If you do, that's also fine. Just know that these are things for you to take into account that you could fix in post that will make your story even better. These are not things that you have to be perfect at right away. These are just things that you can use to fix your story if you're having a little bit of trouble, and can ultimately increase your chances, like with this competition coming up, of being able to win something fun. And hey, even if you don't win something fun, these will improve your story craft overall. Okay, that being said, so we don't have any heart attacks. Let's move into the actual lesson. Okay, so with short stories, now I know I say this one a lot, but I feel like it needs reiterating because of the fact that short stories have the biggest problem with this. Novels, novellas, sure, showing and not telling instead of showing can be a problem, but it's less likely to be a problem because there's so much material you can dive into, right? Whereas with a short story, you're pretty much either trying to race through a plot really quick, we're going to talk about that later, or you're trying to get just the bare minimum down, right? You're just trying to get it out, and that's why I said don't worry about these things till after, because they're hard. So with Show Don't Tell, I'm going to go over it again just in case those on the video haven't heard of this before. So telling is when you state it like a fact in a textbook. She is blonde. She is 14. She loves horses. I don't know. Making up random crap as I go. However, with Show Don't Tell, you want to show it through action. So for example, she twisted her blonde hair, or she flipped her blonde hair, or she's braiding her blonde hair. That all shows that she has blonde hair instead of stating it like a fact. And then, for example, showing her love of horses. You could show the fact that she has a backpack covered in horses. What does that tell you? She probably likes horses. Either that or she has a parent who has no idea what she actually likes.
That could be an interesting way to tell that actually they give her something that's
right.
just
not what she likes at all, and have her be like constantly disgusted
like, I like
with
octopuses. Oh, well, you like horses now.
it. Exactly. See, but that's another way you can show it. You could have her be like disgusted with the bag if she doesn't like horses, and be like, ugh, why do I have this horse backpack? And then you are able to show that she doesn't like it. So those are just some ideas, some ways that you can show with action. Now, the most important part of the reason why short stories tend to need this the most is because with short stories, generally what you want to do is you want to dive deep into the character, but the plot usually is simple. And so as a result of that, showing and not telling is going to help immerse the reader in your story very quickly. Because with short stories, you don't have a lot of time to immerse them in the story. With a novel, sure, you want to immerse them quickly, but you have about a chapter before you lose them. Whereas with a short story, that chapter pretty much is your story. You have maybe a page to catch their attention, and then they're done. They're gone. They left. So with short stories, in some ways, it's even harder than novels and novellas because of the fact that you have to get right to the meat of the story. You can't just be like meandering through the fields. You have to be at the scene of the action. You have to dive right in and jump in. So that being said, showing rather than telling is a good way to do that. Now, does anyone have any questions about showing rather than telling, or why it's important? Yes?
I can never figure out how to do it without characteristics. I can do it with characteristics
Yeah.
of anything else. I can't figure out how to do it.
Define everything else. Everything else is
Like-
vague.
Like something besides she's 14.
Okay, so like, give me an example of something.
years of age.
I don't know, same thing.
So give me an example of like something you've tried to describe and you couldn't feel like you could show it.
I will come back to it.
Okay, that's okay. I was just like, I would be happy to help. I just don't know what kinds of things you're looking for.
You
Because if
could
you're
say
looking,
she's like in middle school.
so if you're
or high
talking
school.
about age, that's different. But it didn't sound like you were talking about age, or am I wrong?
Characteristics like blonde or
Yeah, or easy, but you're worried about age and things like that. Is that what you're
No.
saying?
things
No?
besides age.
Things besides age. So
Yeah.
let me know if you think of an example of things besides age, because I would love to talk about that. It sounds like a great question. I just need an example. Yes, Eliora.
How about explaining like how architecture is? Like,
Architecture, that's a great one.
If
Mhm.
you're showing this young person's apartment building.
Yeah,
And you want to show kind of the layout of
Yeah.
the room.
absolutely.
How would you tell that? Like show that?
Yeah, show rather than tell instead of saying it has 2 bedrooms, etc. Yeah, totally. That's a great question. Thank you for that. So with architecture, I'm just going to use my own apartment as an example. Slightly embarrassed. My apartment's great, but the estate of it is kind of a little bit of a mess. So if I was to show my apartment and rather than telling about my apartment, I might have a scene of me walking in, locking the door behind me, and I always use the back door rather than the front door because there's a bunch of stuff in front of the front door because I'm a mess. So that kind of shows where things are in relation to the house, the fact that I come through the back door. I'd lock the door and then I'd turn and put my keys on the kitchen counter. Now that tells you that the back door is next to the kitchen counter, right? But you're showing it because I'm putting the keys on the kitchen counter immediately. And so that's showing that the kitchen is there. Then I might walk over and grab a water glass and then go sit on my couch immediately afterwards. That tells you that the living room and the kitchen have to be nearby because I probably wouldn't walk all the way across the apartment. Yes.
So you're kind of making it like flow into the story.
Yes.
Instead of like setting apart a chunk of the story. where you
Exactly.
specifically say it.
Yes. Make it as part of a scene rather than making it a chunk of information at the beginning. Exactly. Yeah. So, perfect. If you have any further questions about architecture, I'd love to talk about architecture. I think it's one of the hardest ones because this is the reason white room syndrome is a thing, where people just don't describe the setting at all because it's hard to show and not tell setting. So yeah, if you have any further questions, please let me know. Do you have an example yet?
That fits into it.
Okay, it fits into it? Great, perfect. Okay, I'm glad. Glad it worked out like that. All right, the next one. Okay, this goes for novels and novellas too, but especially with short stories. Again, this is one of these things where short stories, everything is amplified because you have so little time to get the reader's attention, right? I think if you can nail a really good first line in a short story, your novels and novellas are going to be infinitely better because you need to get them and get their attention by that first line and first paragraph.
First lines are like my favorite thing to write, 'cause it's just
Right?
like, it's like the hook.
You have to hook them in, and you gotta make sure you hook them in tight. It can't just be like, oh, this is interesting. It has to be like, no, this is the most interesting thing ever. If I don't keep reading, I'm gonna die. Like, you need your readers to feel that way.
I've read books like that.
Yeah.
So, yes, where you're like, oh my gosh, I have to keep going. So, oh my gosh, that looks like an M. All right, gotta love my handwriting. Okay.
Professional
Don't mind the
writer,
handwriting.
right. That-
Yes.
Well, that you would be teaching a writing class if you couldn't write, but handwriting needs to be
Thank
done.
goodness, yes. Thank goodness I'm an editor where I have to do it online instead of actually like
Yeah.
scribbling in the pages. Yeah. Yes. All right. So this is a big thing, especially as a professional editor, that I pull up all the time. I notice this a lot, especially with new and beginning writers, and it's not a problem. Everyone struggles with it. Honestly, I haven't come across a single first line yet that has been perfect first right off the bat. Like, generally it needs some help, most of the time. So don't feel bad if your first line needs some help. That's normal. So that being said, things that make a first line interesting. Deep emotion. And especially with the MC. This is going to connect us to your character. This is going to want us to read more purely because of the fact that we as readers are now like, oh my gosh, I vibe with this character so hard, therefore I want to continue to read about them. Or if there's a deep emotion, like they're literally crying into a birthday cake, you're like, I want to know why they're crying into their birthday cake. This is messed up.
I know we could be crying on our birthday.
So, as a result, you want a deep emotion with the MC, or alternatively, you want to jump into the action of the story. So whether it, and by action I don't always mean it has to be a gunfight or a car chase. I mean, those are cool, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. With action, it can also be something as simple as she's yelling her guts out at her brother because he just destroyed her prize art project the night before it's due or something like that. That's action, right? That's still action. Sure, it's not gunfights and car chases, but it's still action because something is happening and you're going, oh my gosh, this is messed up. So it's making you want to read more because you're like, well, I'm lost and I want to not be lost. You don't want to completely lose your reader, but if they're a little lost and want to find out more, that's what you want. You want them to be able to find out more. If they're so lost that they have no idea what's happening, that's bad. There's a fine line. All right. Do you have any questions about first lines? Feeling pretty good about first line? Oh, question? Yes.
Their first and last name. You just do the
First and last name?
together in the first sentence?
Generally it depends on the importance of the first and last name. If their last name's important, then mention their last name. Otherwise, honestly, I haven't given a last name to any of my characters because it hasn't really come up or mattered. However, if they're like Lord and Lady Duke of Arlington or whatever, then their last name's kind of important, right? Because it's a status thing. So in that case, I would mention it within the first line. But if their last name is not important until later, you don't really need a last name until later. That might be a controversial opinion, but it is my opinion. I would personally say first name is the only thing you need in the first line necessarily. And sometimes you don't even need a first name in the first line. Like I said, if they're yelling at each other, the best first line that I could come up with when they're yelling at each other is just a straight up line of dialogue. No name, just a line of dialogue. And then stating maybe, I don't know,
This
Doris said, or Doris was shouting, or Doris threw something across the room. I prefer action text. But yeah.
Action text can be fun.
Action tags are really fun. But as a result of that, that kind of shows you who's talking and introduces someone without saying, this is Doris, right? Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Again, first lines are never going to be perfect right off the bat, honestly. I've had very few first lines be perfect right off the bat. In fact, most of my first lines, I've done maybe 4 or 5 different drafts of them before I picked a final first line. So, like I said, don't worry about any of this until after you're finished. Then go back and be like, how could I spice this up? And sometimes I find with writers, we tend to put our best first lines 3 or 4 lines down the page. It's actually a funny thing that I've run into with almost all of my clients. Their best first line is 3 or 4 lines down the page. And I'm like, no, this line, this is what got me interested. The rest can go later, but this, you need this up front. Oh, speaking of first lines, totally forgot to mention this, but this is important. When doing a short story, your first line needs action or needs deep emotion. But, side note, for novellas and novels, you need to make sure that if you're doing a prologue, that your first line in your prologue and your first line in your first chapter are just as killer. Why? Because 90% of people don't read prologues. I know it sucks for all of us who read prologues. We're like, what? How can you not read the prologue? But
It's context.
it gives context, it gives meaning. But unfortunately, lots of people hate prologues. As a result of that, that means that you have to make your first line in your first chapter just as killer as the first line in the prologue, because if they didn't read that prologue, you need them to still be just as interested starting from chapter 1. Just a thought. All right, next, we're going to talk about this. Now, this is slightly more of an advanced concept, so you don't necessarily have to worry about this. However, I will say that It is an advanced concept for a reason, and that is because even though it's hard to nail, when you nail it, your readers are going to be delighted. So, resonance. What am I talking about when I say resonance? This is when a theme goes throughout the book that isn't forced. It's just a natural flowing theme that gives emotional depth to the beginning and end. So, for example, if at the beginning someone is like, I don't really know who I am, and then by the end of the story, they've discovered their identity.
Or do this.
It feels good, right? As a reader, it feels good. Why does it feel good? Because it's emotional and it connects us to the reader in a way that flows naturally. And the reader, we like that. We like that a lot. And so with resonance, it's not always about forcing a theme too. I want to make that clear. Oftentimes if you force a theme, like this whole book is going to be about bullying, that can be harder because you're trying so hard to force a theme that you miss all the best scenes. However, with resonance, more humans. With resonance though, if you're doing emotional resonance, feel free to, there are more chairs, okay. If you're doing emotional resonance, you just want to make sure that your beginning and ending of the story in particular flow together well, and that you tie it together with scenes in the middle. So if they're finding their identity, have it be that by the end they found their identity, but in the beginning they're lost, and so they find clues to their identity throughout. You don't want it to be like, there's nothing about identity all the way until the end.
Yeah.
That feels weird.
Probably
That feels weird. You want to make sure that the theme flows cohesively. Now that's why resonance is hard, because it's the fine line of not forcing a theme, but also making sure that you keep a cohesive theme. Kind of goes both ways. It's a little difficult. With short stories, it's a little easier because generally, we're going to talk about this here in a minute, you want a simple plot for a short story. And I don't mean like it's too simple, like she found the cookie thief and the cookie thief was right over there.
Not like that. Can you see the ocean?
Exactly. It's not like a children's book simple, but we still want a simple plot. If you add in too many things, then you're basically just trying to summarize a novel. And that's not what we're looking for in a short story. We're not looking for a novel summary. We're looking for a story, a cohesive little block of story. Now, if you want to leave it on a cliffhanger and kind of have it be like semi-first chapter vibes, that's okay. But just make sure that your cliffhanger still feels good as an ending. Make sure that it's not like so cliffhangery that they're literally hanging off a cliff and then you're just like, bye, I'm done. That's the problem. So again, there are fine lines here. All right. Now with resonance, it's often I think the best resonance is with your genre. Now, to back up and explain this a little bit. If you're doing a mystery, you generally want the resonance to be something mysterious or something about like good versus evil and morally gray, right? That tends to be
Man
more
versus
mystery
man.
themes.
Man
Yeah,
versus
man versus man, more like Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty vibes. Whereas if you're doing fantasy, the resonance is to be an escape from reality into this ultimate cool world, right? Or if it's historical, then you want the resonance to be whatever historical event you're talking about. If you're talking about slavery, you want that resonance to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this actually happened. Or if you're talking about some sort of revolution, you want to feel themes of freedom, you know, like you want the theme to fit with the genre you're writing. Now there are all sorts of different genres. Just make sure that whatever genre you pick, you generally stick within that genre, because when you genre jump, wow, that's when it gets weird. So for example, if you start your story with, it's a horror and it's spooky, and then by the end it's like, they fell in love, you're like, excuse me? You want to make sure that the theme is apparent from the beginning and that you don't lose your reader by the end. All right, any questions regarding resonance? No questions? Okay, cool. If you have any questions later, just remember that you can always email me questions with the Writers Club email that I give out every week. Yes?
I just want to say, I was reading this book the other day,
Mhm.
and it suddenly went from having these two main characters
Yeah.
that are annoying,
Yeah.
and then this kind of side character they
Mhm.
introduce, and then all of a sudden the side character becomes the main character, and
Right.
they switch genres.
Right,
I
and
was
you're like,
what in the name
What is
of what is
happening?
going on?
Yeah.
And it turned out it was just a dream, but it really bugged me. Because I was
Yeah,
like,
oh gosh.
Were you dreaming
I
about reading a book,
was.
were you dreaming about reading a book, or was there a dream in the book?
Dream in the book.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'm like,
Dreaming in the book. They
Oh,
dreamed
man.
that they were like this duchess or something, and it was like supposed to be modern day, and I was like,
Wow.
I don't understand.
Yeah,
Why do you
as-
need to put this
like
in
author,
there?
Yeah.
author, what have you done?
What have you done? Yeah. So I'll be honest, it's definitely a rough. Yeah, this is why we have editors, and I know that a lot of you think, editors, but as a person who thought that and then became a professional editor, everyone needs one, regardless of how famous you are. Even super famous people like Brandon Sanderson definitely need an editor. Let me tell you right now, you know how thick his books are? That's only 1/3. His editor takes out 2/3 of the novel. Can you imagine seeing those bricks on shelves?
Those could be lethal weapons.
Exactly! They'd be lethal grade weapons at that point.
He
Just
has-
drop one from a building
he
and
has
someone
to-
die by Brandon
He has
Sanderson.
he has to take out 2/3 of the book, or else it's not legal anymore.
Yeah, seriously. No, yeah. So his editor, most patient person on the planet. Like, oh my gosh. When they admitted that on a podcast, I was just like, how you lie? All right.
It's like, how are your eyes not falling out of your
Yes,
head?
like what is happening? All right. So yes, I agree with things like dream sequences and stuff like that. If they don't add any beneficial meat to the story and you don't make it clear that it's a dream sequence and things like that, problems. And especially in short stories. You want to make sure, we're going to talk about this later, but dream sequences and flashbacks, controversial topic in short stories. I generally say no because it's just confusing. Unless it's absolutely necessary. But even then, I generally say no. But
Yeah.
that's just me.
You're like, find another way, child.
Find some other way. All right, there we go. So, next we're going to talk about foreshadowing.
Full house today. This is amazing.
I know, right? So,
Don't miss this one.
with foreshadowing.
Grab a chair and go.
Here, feel free. Grab lots of chairs. There's lots of chairs. All right. So with foreshadowing, I know this is hard with short stories because you only have a teeny little bit of space and so many things that you want to tell. However, foreshadowing is critical, especially if you're doing something that by the end of the story, kind of like with the dream and stuff like that, you need to make sense of things. You need to smooth things over and sort things out. Now, with foreshadowing in short stories, the best part about it is it doesn't have to be blunt because they aren't going to miss it. Whereas in a novel, sometimes you have to be a little blunt with your foreshadowing because they might not remember it by chapter 8 otherwise. But in a short story, it can be very mild. One of my favorite short stories with foreshadowing is Ray Bradbury. Oh my gosh, I wish I could remember the actual title of the short story. But he does a great job with lots of science fiction short stories. One of them is where there's this AI house, smart home, basically. Yeah.
Is that the one about
And-
the nuclear bomb?
No, not quite. So he has an AI smart house, and there's these parents, and the parents are like, hey, these kids are being a little spoiled, so we're going to try to pull a hard line with them. And they start seeing that the room where the kids live in has this like Sahara Desert theme and has these random lions in the background, and they're always prowling around and stalking around creepily. And then by the end, the parents are dead.
Oh,
So,
the
foreshadow.
parents?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you said the parents.
Parents, yes.
Parents are
So,
dead.
the parents are dead. Well, that was very obviously foreshadowed. You're having stalking lions in the background. You're going, something's not right. Like, with that short story, it wasn't obvious. It was very subtle. You're kind of like stalking lions. That's weird. But then by the end, you're like, oh, so the smart house wants to kill them because it likes the kids. Got it.
That's suspicious.
Yes.
That's weird.
So because it's a short story, you don't have to be as blunt with foreshadowing, and you don't have to do as much of it, but you still need it. If you don't foreshadow at all, then the reader's going to be lost by the time you hit the end. So it's this fine line of subtle, minor foreshadowing, but not beating them over the head with a stick. You don't want your readers to feel like you're abusing them, but you also don't want them to feel totally lost. You want them to feel gently poked with a stick and be like, why am I feeling like I'm being poked with a stick? You don't want them to be like, ha-ha, with a club, bash their brains out. That's
That's
bad. Don't do that. Whoop. And don't throw markers.
I once read a book where
Thank you.
the father's brains got spread all over.
Oof.
And then it got really sad.
That's very
And then
sad.
even sadder.
All right.
Absolutely hilarious.
All right.
Oh
yeah.
Father's Day.
All right.
See, you would say so, and then, Fury dies, and you're just a ball of tears.
What? No, I feel good.
No, you
All right.
didn't. It was Louie
So-
the raccoon.
Fury from Martha?
No, we need a cat Fury.
So, the next element that you're going to want in your short stories is that of mystery. Now, this might not sound great because you're like, you just said you don't want to lose them. That's why foreshadowing is important. You want the mystery, but also the foreshadowing.
Yeah, you want to be leading them through a spooky corn maze, but you don't want to be dashing when they have a broken leg.
Exactly. There's a problem there. So, with elements of mystery in a short story, basically, you just don't have to tell them everything. If they randomly had a date with this guy 5 years ago, unless it's important to the plot, don't mention it. Leave it out. In a short story. In a novel or novella, absolutely leave that in. Drama. But
Trying to get as much
exactly.
involved as
But that's why
possible.
novels and novellas are different from short stories. Short stories, you want to generally leave the drama out of it unless the whole point is the drama. If the whole point's drama, please feel free to do the drama. But if the point is not drama, leave it out. So with that being said, things like last names, for instance, that we mentioned earlier. This is another element of mystery in a short story that unless it is crucial that you know the last name, leave it a mystery. We do not need to know. As a reader, unless it is crucial to the plot, generally in a short story, you can leave it out. And I know this might be a controversial opinion. Some people may disagree with me, but most people I found when I was doing research last night mentioned the fact that you want to actually leave the character. You want to make sure they're connected to the character, but that they're not so connected to the character that when they finish the short story, they're just devastated. That's a problem. You want to make sure that they're connected in a way that leads them through the story, but you still have an element of mystery. It's kind of like, why do our siblings get on our nerves? Because we know everything about them and they're there all the time, right?
But when they leave for college, you
Yeah,
get really
my-
sad.
Exactly, but then when they leave for
Lies.
college, you're really, really sad, and you're like, why are you gone? That's because now there's an element of mystery. You don't know half of their lives, right? You go back and you're like, what? You're dating a person? What? You went to this cool college class? What? You changed your major? There's mystery now to this person that there wasn't before.
Why did I do hair?
So instead of being annoyed at them for being like, oh, of course they dyed their hair pink, you're like, what? You dyed your hair pink? And you want that kind of mystery in your short story because then you can feel like this character constantly has things that's revealing, which makes your reader want to keep going because they want to learn more. Any questions about mystery?
How mysterious could it be?
If you're too mysterious, you completely lose the reader. So as long as the reader isn't completely lost, you can be pretty mysterious. But you want to make sure that they're not completely lost in the woods. There's a difference between, guiding them through a particularly mysterious path and dropping them into the middle of a forest with no red markers and mushrooms everywhere. That's a problem.
Zelda.
Yes. You don't want to drop them in the middle of the world but even Zelda, it gives you a prelude, right?
Yes.
You kind of know where you are. Yes.
I think that's one of the reasons why editors are so important is because when you're writing for example, a mystery novel
Yeah.
where there's tons of mystery,
Yes.
you already know all the answers
Yes.
to everything. So when you read it, you're like, well, obviously it's this.
Right.
But an editor doesn't know everything yet, so they can kind of be your test, your guinea pig. and
Exactly.
say, you know what? This wasn't very clear at all.
Exactly. They can help make sure that things are clear. Thank you. So yes, this is why editing is important. Self-editing and editors in particular, because like Eliora said, we have a fresh set of eyes. So that being said, if any of you need stuff edited, I'm more than happy to help. But yes, with editing, a fresh set of eyes is ultimately what you're going for. Yes, they're going to help you with grammar. Yes, they're going to help you fix plot holes. But the reason they're going to be able to do that is because it's a fresh set of eyes. You've been staring at this for months. They haven't. Yes.
Do you know the thing where basically an artist looks at their piece so long they see every mistake, but someone who looks at it doesn't see those? Pretty
Yep.
much the exact opposite.
Exactly. It's pretty much the exact opposite of that. And there are times when you think things are a mistake that are actually not a mistake too. There are times where I've had clients say, oh, I'm super worried about this scene, it's the worst. And then I read that scene and I'm like, that was actually the best thing in the whole book. Now this scene is
It's like switch that off.
There's the other scene, however.
This other scene, however, that you loved and thought did great, I'm sorry, there's a plot hole. Like, so this is why a fresh set of eyes is important. Alright. So,
Spider's novel body.
alright.
Dimension. Wow.
Okay. Here comes the toughie.
Oh.
Simple plot. No convoluted craziness. Leave that for the novels and novellas. However, when I say no convoluted craziness, there can be a little convoluted craziness, otherwise it's not a plot. So see, you want simple, but also plot.
You want both of those things
You want both of them together. You don't want, like I said earlier, they are looking for a thief and the thief is right there.
No.
Too simple.
You want there's a thief, but he's behind. the
That's
bush,
a
and they don't-
Exactly,
and
but
the-
he's behind the
And
bush.
also the person searching is blind, so.
Exactly, and also the person. Exactly, that makes sense. So
They're
it's
looking for a
simple,
thief, but he's right
but a
next to
plot.
Smith.
You want to
Oh.
make sure, because if you add too many elements to a short story, it starts to water it down. And why does it water it down? Because you only have X amount of pages, right? Like, for example, with the upcoming short story contest, you have 6,000 words at maximum. That seems like a lot, but when you actually do the math, that's not that much. But that is pretty standard for a short story. The longest short story is about 10,000 words. So it's
Then it
not that
becomes
much shorter.
Then it becomes a book.
Yes, then you start hitting novella length once you hit 15 to 20,000 words. So it's kind of like, it's just this kind of gradation. But anyway, speaking of which, with short stories, you want to make sure that the plot is simple because you don't want to water it down. You want to make sure that you're not summarizing a novella or a novel. When you summarize a novella or a novel, that isn't a short story ultimately. That's just a summary of a novella or a novel. However, with a simple plot, you can dive deep into the beauty that is the characters of the plot. That's why you want a simple plot. You want it to be simple because then that means you can dive in with all your heart. And with that being said, it doesn't have to be perfectly simple. Yeah, absolutely. And if she wants to finish it later, I always record these lessons, so she can look at the American Fork Library YouTube page if she wants to see the rest.
Perfect.
Good. See ya. Thank you for coming. All right. So with simple plot, where was I? I got very distracted. Oh, that's what I was gonna say. So for example, a simple plot could involve a plot twist. Absolutely. So for example, we had a bunch of short stories last month, remember? So one of the plot twists that I really liked, I won't name who, because then I feel like I'd be showing favoritism, but I'm not trying to be favoritism, I'm just saying this was a good, simple plot. Where the idea is that they're trying to go after a treasure, right? However, when going after that treasure, turns out that the person they're working with is a monster who tries to eat them. That's a good, simple plot, right? Two people going after a treasure, monster tries to eat them. Pretty simple. However, it was just plotty enough because of the complexity of the person being a monster that it helped add a sense of illusion and mystery to it. Whereas it was still simple because it had a concept that was A plus B equals C. Very simple. Yes?
What time is it?
It is 3:56. Sorry, that is really tiny on my screen. All right.
It's tiny on every screen. It's just tiny in like
Right, it's just,
proportion.
yes. All right. So, let's see. Do you have any guys have any questions about simple plot? Yes.
What's the difference between a novella and a novel?
Ooh, great question. So the novel and a novella. Novella is more between 20,000 to 40,000 words in length.
That's short.
That's about where it is. Sometimes it can be as little as 15,000, but that's generally more considered like an extra long short story.
It's like uber long.
Yeah, uber long short story. And the purpose of a novella is to tell a short story in a longer way because there's too many complexities to tell it in a short story format. Whereas a novel is typically, and I'm using all of these references from YA and above. These are not the same numbers if you're doing junior novels. So if you're writing for 9-year-olds, these are not the same numbers. So, but this is YA and above. Then with a novel, you're going to be 50,000 word minimum. Now I know this sounds insane, but the reason why is because generally with a YA novel, you want the plot to be complex, and the plot can't be complex if you're summarizing too much. And if you're summarizing too much, you're going to end up less than 50,000 words. It's just how it works. So the difference is word count, but the difference is also the complexity of the plot, which is why the word count changes. So a simple plot, like we've been talking about, is a short story. A semi-simple plot, where it has some complexities to it, but it's mostly simple, is a novella. And then a super complex and convoluted plot is a novel. And then when you get into epic fantasy, it basically doesn't even count because those are the bricks that you get. So, does that answer your question? Okay, cool. So it's basically plot complexity and then word count that dictate that. All right. So, moving on with that. Next thing that I noticed was mentioned a lot, and I definitely agree with this, is use the 5 senses. And I know I give 5 points on the thing for using all 5 senses. Yes, that's a thing. But the reason why is because it's important. You only have a short amount of pages to hook your reader, and the best way to immerse your reader in your story is to use as many of the 5 senses as possible. Yes.
If you're writing, my friend gave me a tip where apparently, like, if you're writing physical horror,
Yeah.
one way to make it scarier is describe off the smells.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I definitely agree. One of my favorite things that a client did once was she was describing the villain, and the villain like had the MC close to the face, and she started like breathing heavy on the MC, and the MC's like describing what the smell was, and I'm just sitting there going like, I literally commented on her thing as a professional editor. I'm like, I'm gagging, so that means you did a good job.
Like, congratulations, this was disgusting.
Exactly. Congratulations, you did a great job making the villain absolutely vomit worthy. All right. So that's actually a good thing. So yeah, 5 senses, absolutely. Things like smell can make something, if you do it, truly disgusting. Or things like hearing. Hearing, especially in a horror and things like that, if you're hearing like twigs snap in the dead of night in a forest where you're pretty sure you're being chased by someone, creepy.
Or an empty room that seems to go up forever.
Yes.
And you hear something fall down behind you.
And you're just like, no, nobody, no.
You can't run. You're locked in there with cement rooms.
It's just like, no thanks. But yeah, so the 5 senses help immerse you in the story. And when I say the 5 senses, typically, most of us who aren't blind, pretty sure all of you are legally able to see, or at least have glasses. None of you are considered legally blind. However, if anyone is watching this, I'm sorry if you are blind, that's rough. But most people who are not blind tend to write stories with visual components, right? And that tends to be the number 1 sense. The second sense that I notice is used the most often is touch. And that's because touching things and seeing things are the main thing we do. We don't think about taste and smell and hearing a lot. Because even though we hear a lot of things, sometimes we're so in our own head we're not really paying attention, right?
Hey, that's most of the day.
So that's why it's important to do the 5 senses in your short story though, because then your reader feels like their senses are all being taken up with this story. And you're able to immerse them. This also helps with the showing and not telling. For example, if instead of saying there is a bakery to your left, if they're smelling cinnamon buns, probably a bakery nearby, unless they're insane.
Unless they ate so many buns earlier that they just smell like they were smelling.
Their breath smells like
Or
cinnamon
they
buns.
went to the mall earlier and shoved a thing in their pocket.
Yep, exactly. So it's like, there you go. But generally, see, those all tell you there's probably something having to do with cinnamon buns, right? That tells you that, regardless of the fact that you're showing and not telling us that. Yes.
You said blind people watching this video. That's
I know, but they could be. There could be.
but they're not watching.
But they're not watching. They're listening. My apologies. I wasn't. I'm sorry.
Probably not.
I've never
I'm
been
really
blind, so I
angry
don't know.
for it.
All right.
I'm blind, I cannot see.
Then it's all
So-
the smells.
Stop writing on the board.
So stop writing on the board. It's not helpful. All right.
Markers don't work anyway.
Markers don't- I was gonna say they work this time. Thank goodness. All right. Now we're gonna talk about character.
Oh, no.
Except we're gonna talk about amounts.
Oh no. I have a hard time putting a bunch of characters in one scene because then I'm like, who the heck is talking?
Exactly.
And I, as the
And
author,
it's-
confused.
And especially with short stories. Again, you don't want your reader to be drowning. You want them to have just enough mystery to keep reading, but you don't want them to constantly being like, who is Dave? That's a problem.
That was some of the side characters, like, what is going on?
Exactly. You don't want this to happen. So with character amounts, this is again where novel, novella, and short story come into play. Short stories, hard line I'm drawing right there. 3 to 4 characters in short stories. If you do any, and that's even a little rough. I would say heavily 2 to 3. If you're gonna do 3 to 4, focus on a primary 3, and then the 4th one is just kind of there. And if you want to do more than 4 and you have like a crew and it's a ship of 6, don't mention names. Just kind of have them be like, hey there, bud. So that way they don't have to remember. Because the second you mention a name, someone feels like they have to remember it. And the more that they have to remember in a short story, it's going to be rough. Yes.
So, for example, if you were writing a short story
Mhm.
where somebody went shopping
Yes.
and they talk to the cashier and they're like,
Yes.
oh, thank you, and then they go home and you never see the cashier again.
Exactly.
That character doesn't really count.
But don't be like,
You don't, yeah, no, that character doesn't count. That's my point.
And
Is
she looks at the
named
name
characters.
tag.
I should specify named characters that have a plot significance. If they're talking to a cashier and they're just like, oh, hey, I hope you have a great day, and then they look at their name tag and they're like, Mary, that indicates that maybe they'll have
and
plot
then Mary
importance
was
later.
the villain all along.
Exactly, that indicates they'll have plot importance later. But if you don't mention the name and they just go to the cashier and check out and leave, that doesn't count as a character. I'm talking about characters that have a pivotal role in the plot. Does that make sense? Perfect, yes.
Like, sort of like you could do like the cashier, like you do the short story first, and then like you make a novel of like what happens after, and
What
then
happened
the
after, yes.
cashier appears and like saves them.
My name is Mary.
Yes, so there you go. But so with that being said, short stories, so with short stories I say 3 to 4. With a novella, you can do probably more like 5 to 6. With a novel,
A million.
you can get as many as 6 to probably 9, but 9 stretching it. However, with that being said, you don't want to introduce all these characters in your novel up front. Now, I know
Yes.
we're talking about short stories today, but I need to say that. Do not introduce all 9 characters up front. Please,
Please don't.
Yes.
Otherwise, I'm like, wait. And then I flip back to the beginning.
Exactly,
Because
you
of
try
the
to figure out
end
who
of
it
the
is,
book, I'm like,
yes.
oh, that's this guy.
Introduce
Okay.
them slowly.
Well, now
Yes.
I can't find my page.
Then you're like you introduce like
Yes,
All
too
at
many.
once.
That is
All,
fair.
Like the background characters.
Yes, I agree. That was my one problem with it. Then they were none. Love Agatha Christie. She did a fabulous job.
Oh, yeah, we
But
were.
holy cow,
I
that's
kept
a
trying
lot of
flipping
people.
back to find who the heck.
I had to, it was actually funny because I had to read that for an English class and she actually printed off a chart with all the names and descriptions just to help because she was like, this is insane.
For an English assignment, we had to write down things we noticed about the characters.
Oh gosh.
Because that was for
She
fun.
just gave
I
it to
kept
us. She
thinking-
was like, no man. Alright, but yeah, so with a novel, you want to make sure that if you're introducing 9 characters, you do so slowly. You don't do so all at once because the second you do it all at once, an editor's going to be like, either combine characters or cut them out now.
it's like kill them. So like in the first chapter you introduce all 9 like characters.
Oh gosh, okay, the sad thing is I have had friends and family members and me who have been guilty of this in the past, and let me tell you right now, none of my readers enjoyed that.
Oh, you know what you could do if you're doing like a prologue?
Mhm.
You don't have to introduce them, but you can have like the mystic looking in this.
That's
this
true.
mask. It could be like, I see 9 people traveling together,
Yes.
but don't be like, it
And
was
then
John and Billy and Susie.
Right, you don't have to say all the
Basic
names, but
names
just
of
say
it.
there are 9 later, eventually.
There are 9, but will there be 9 when we end? Da, 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 da.
Yeah.
Foreshadowing.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, like,
All right.
will the end were only like 2?
No.
And then it's like high five, our mission is done. Pull out.
So, with this next element, in short stories in particular, you're going to want to suggest a backstory, but you don't want to just blatantly say, here is their whole backstory.
No.
Because it's not, unless it's important to the plot, you don't want to mention it. So you might be able to say like, oh yeah, that's my ex in the corner, but don't give them a name that clearly just says they had history together. And that clearly they've dated before.
And then the ex turns out to be like the villain.
Unless they're the villain or something, then please give them a name.
Or you could give them a name later.
This is true. Or you name them later. They're just like the ex that I hate, and then later they're like, it's Dave. I don't know why Dave is the name
Jared.
of the day.
It's Jared.
All right. So, with that being said, you just suggest a backstory. Don't necessarily have to say their whole backstory up front. And especially with characters that you introduce later on. If you have like a villain or something like that, you might want to foreshadow a backstory and then explain at the end, kind of like Sherlock Holmesian, you know, and clearly all this stuff was planned out by him. And they're like, gasp, and they see it. That is better than just being like, by the way, blah, and dumping the whole backstory in the beginning. Don't do that. Or at
It's
the
like-
end.
You could have,
Alright,
you could have
I'm
like
lost.
a prologue that's also a flashback.
Yes, prologues or things like that.
She's
Yes.
like, alright, I'm lost. What happened here?
All right. Okay, I have way more stuff to talk about than I might have time. We have another 15 minutes, so we'll see if I can fit this all in. All right. So next we're going to talk about dialogue. With short stories, you want to make sure that your dialogue has importance. So, this being said, if you have, hey, cute dog, nice, I love your dog. That dog better be important, otherwise that dialogue needs
And
to
then
go.
the dog explodes.
Exactly. If the dog explodes, then okay, let's go.
No
Wait,
more
wait.
cute dog.
The dog gets killed, and that's when John Wick got started.
See, there you go. You need an actual like importance for the dog. Otherwise, don't mention the dog. You can be like they are walking their dog somewhere in the scene, but you don't have to have them talk about the dog. Have them talk about something else that's actually important.
It's like, did you hear about like the 7 murders that happened yesterday?
Yes,
Also cute
exactly.
dog, but
Talk
also
about that.
murder.
And also murder. All right. So, with that being said, any questions about dialogue or 5 senses or anything like that so far? Feeling good?
Yep.
Yes.
Is it okay to put dialogue that's not necessarily needed, but like makes it so that then it's not immediately like, hey, we're gonna talk about something really important.
If it's a short story, I'd actually say no. I would say generally get to the meat of the dialogue and get to the meat of the story. Don't have them be like, hi, Kara, I'm Kara. Oh, that's fun, we have the same name.
And this
Maybe that would be it. I would say you could have a little intro dialogue like that, but keep it to 1 to 2 lines.
No, yeah, that
If you're gonna have a giant interlude, no. But yeah.
that was up to like 20 pages.
But yeah, so if you have 1 to 2 sentences, I'd say keep it to 1 to 2 sentences of unnecessary dialogue. But even then, you want to keep your dialogue necessary just because in a short story, you have so little time to fit details in and so few words. So as a result, what words are going to get cut? The ones that aren't plot important. No, that's fair. That's fair. So it's hard. It's hard. Let's be real. It's
That's the
very
worst thing to
hard.
write.
If you want
Filler.
filler
Filler's
is
the
hard.
worst.
So I'll be honest. Filler, I will say, filler is great in novels. Filler is great in novellas, even. But filler, short
Exactly.
stories
That's why
is not
short
a thing.
stories are awesome. 'Cause you don't have to write stupid filler.
So you can do a tiny bit of filler in short stories, but
No.
just make sure it's tiny.
I
Like,
just, instead of filler, I do
Yeah.
smaller plot points that don't matter as much, but are just like, oh, that's
That's fair.
relevant to the story, actually,
Yes.
instead of
I would
filler.
say if the dialogue doesn't move the character if it doesn't move the plot forward or introduce more about the character. So if you're introducing more about the character, like secretly they have this underground base and they're being all shifty, then that's important because it's moving the character forward even if it's not moving the plot forward. So I'd say character or plot, great.
That
If
sounds
it's
like
not
both.
moving forward either, that's true. It's kind of both. If it's not moving either forward, then I'd probably say keep it to a minimum as much as you can, or cut it out altogether. That's just my opinion. If you have any like controversial things, or you have a section in a story that you're like, I don't know, this doesn't make sense, I can always read over it and give you feedback on it. Sound good? Okay. Because I will say, some filler is okay, but you want to make sure that it, like I said, moves things forward. All right. So, next thing we're going to talk about is POV, also known as point of view. Generally,
on the internet.
generally stick to one point of view. One.
Or else it gets confusing.
Yeah, or else it gets confusing.
Oh,
exactly.
I thought you said why.
No, one. No, yeah, one point of view. Generally, especially in short stories, in novels, you can go to as many as maybe 4, but generally, no, never. Maybe 4. You could maybe even do as many as all 9 characters have their own point of view. But if that's the case, you need to make sure all 9 points of view have value. If one of their points of view is just I'm sitting at home and I'm doing my homework, skip that point of view.
Wait, the homework is about like the World War II, and then World War II is gonna be on to World War III, because World War III is actually gonna destroy the whole
Well, they get into spy school by
Alright.
saying how they would start World War III, obviously.
So, with point of view in short stories, you want to keep it to 1 person, maybe 2, but I would say almost never 2, only because it gets a little confusing and muddling. So I'd say generally stick with 1.
Stick with 7 minutes.
Ugh, please don't.
Just
All right.
put every single point of view from every single person on the planet.
Yeah.
7 billion.
Yes.
Like, that's a long book. That's 7
Or you
billion.
can put it in 7 billion books.
Oh yeah, write a story about every single person. That would suck and take
Yeah,
more
yeah,
than a
so
lifetime.
Good luck getting that published.
Yeah.
Unless he went home and ate a block of cheese. Yes, he is American.
It's American cheese. Run.
Run! The Swiss are coming with their cheese.
You guys are great. All right. So, let's see. So, with short stories, you want to make sure you nail the ending. You want to make sure that that ending was well foreshadowed. You want to make sure that when you're moving up to the ending that you know exactly where things are going. You want to make sure that as you're wrapping things up towards the end, everything seems obvious, or if you're doing a plot twist, then you need to make sure that you leave it off on a semi-cliffhanger. So it doesn't have to be like a huge cliffhanger, like, oh no, I'm dying, but it should be a semi-cliffhanger if you're doing a plot twist right near the end, because that's kind of important. However, if you also just want to do a plot twist and then immediately have them die, that's an ending too.
Yes,
just make
my
sure that it's
favorite.
meant to be a horror or a mystery or a thriller. If you're doing a romance, please don't.
Oh, that is so sad. And then
Really?
you have an after scene of like the main character mourning their love and then going insane.
This is fair. This is
No.
fair.
Wait, you just pull it
That's
from
what
And
I'm
then
right.
in the
That's
next
sad.
one, the dead person returns because they were faking
No.
their death. So
Actually,
they run
no.
away from a secret organization.
See, there you go. There's all sorts of crazy ways you can nail it. Just make sure that whatever you're doing, you nail that ending and that it's well foreshadowed. Now, that being said, it's hard to tell if you're nailing an ending because you're the one writing it. As we said earlier, you might be staring at it for days and you don't know anymore what blue and black and white is because you're just staring at a page.
like-
That's fair. But that's why we have editors. Please send it to me if you've gotten to that point where you're like, I've edited it until my eyes are starting to explode. Please send it to me before that point. I would be happy to help. Yes.
Could I foreshadow it in a prologue and like have like an unknown narrator narrating it, and at the end she's like, the most important questions are,
Mhm.
why is this happening? Who is like some name, and then the villain is just a different name of that name.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like John.
I'm already confused.
So I would say with a short story, I wouldn't call it a prologue. I would just say from the beginning. But
In
yes,
the beginning.
but in the beginning. But with a novel or novella, I would say you actually probably want to put that in the first chapter, just because, like I said, people don't generally read prologues. And so if people don't read the prologue, then they're just going to be frustrated. I guess they suffer for their consequences of not reading the prologue.
they
But
should've.
You should make them suffer for not reading the prologue.
so
Everything doesn't
you
make
can
sense
leave
at
that
all,
up
but
for
everything
debate.
makes sense.
Either make them suffer for reading the prologue or put it in the first chapter and have it make semi-coherent sense. Yes.
Can I have chapters in a short story?
No. Typically with a short story, you don't have chapters unless you're doing a children's novel. In which case, it's basically the length of a short story, but you're putting in chapters because it's a chapter book for smalls. So I would say generally chapters are not a thing in short stories. It is all basically the length of one chapter, so you don't really need chapter breaks. Because the whole point of a chapter break is to give you a breather moment before you keep reading, because it's a large thing. Whereas a short story is short enough that you don't really need those breaks.
or it's, you know, the, hey, you need to go to sleep of a book.
Yes. Or
And
hey,
the
hey, it's chapter 345. You should probably go to bed.
It's like, it's 2 in the morning, please get some
All right.
tutorial crap.
Next is character motives. Make sure that if your character is following the plot, they have a reason to follow the plot. Now, I know we've talked about this before, but it's important. You need to make sure that that actually makes sense. So, for example, you wouldn't have a police officer working together with a serial killer.
Unless you have a real
Unless you have a good
reasoning.
motive or
For
reason.
example, I read a book where the FBI agent was the serial killer.
Yeah, but see, there you go. They probably had a motive and a reason, and it made sense.
Yeah, trauma. It was trauma.
But see, that makes sense. But you don't want to have it be like the police officer starts working together with serial killer, and they're like,
For
why?
no apparent
For fun.
reason.
And it's like, that's
Like,
not
he
a good
offers me
reason.
a lot of money.
And it's like,
Because they're trying to overthrow the government.
Yeah, because you offered me like 10 cents. And you
And
a lot
you're
of
like,
money.
excuse me?
He
Yeah,
gave
so
me a dog.
they gave me a dog, and I've always wanted a dog.
But mother said no, dogs are too messy.
All right.
You have your own apartment now, don't you? Your
Yes.
apartment's still living at home. That's sad.
Well,
Oh,
I can
man.
do whatever I want. You can't control me.
Or can
You're like, oh, I control you.
All right, let me
This
see.
guy
Let me
doesn't
make sure I
control
didn't.
me. I'd like to see them
All right.
try.
yeah, I think I worked for her. Or is that the
Oh, that's the CIA.
They both.
Action.
They both do.
I thought I was gonna be acting. I'm like, oh, this is my thing.
This line jam.
You can do that. Did I spell that right? Exposition. Yes, I did. All right.
Exposition.
I know how to spell when I'm typing, but when I'm writing it out, sometimes I get anxious. All right. So you can actually do that. I've seen a lot of my fellow writer friends act out scenes in order to figure things out. That's actually a really good thing, especially if you're trying to do emotions. There's this person on Instagram that I find absolutely hilarious for that reason, because they try to act out things that you can tell the author clearly didn't act out beforehand, like jumping up and down angrily. Grrr. And it's like,
He looked. Here's a common one. She looked up through her lashes.
yes, how do you look up through your lashes?
It's like-
yeah, it's like, yeah,
Like,
so.
here, let me just.
Yeah, so, yeah, if you're worried about descriptions sounding wonky, act it out. Try and figure out what it would look like, and then maybe ask a second person and say, what do you think this
Or
looks
act
like?
it out.
Or something
act
like
it
that.
out with me.
Flirtatious
And
is
then
stupid.
Your writing's your wingman.
So there's this like line in the book. I don't
Mhm.
actually know what book it's from, but
That's okay.
it says the eyebrows widened in surprise.
Sorry, just give me a second. Let me somebody's eyebrows widen.
Yeah, I think they're looking to like raised and surprised, but they should definitely have said raised, not widened. Alright.
Or, you know,
Now I'm just
yeah,
imagining their
raised,
eyebrows going from super thin to like bushy Mario brows.
Whoa.
So,
It turns into your hairline.
yes, with those kinds of things, acting things out can be great. Or if you just have a friend that you really trust, you can be like, so when I do this, what do I look like, or whatever, and then like have them
She
describe it
flounced
to you.
away with
Yes, yes, like what does flouncing look like to you? Like that's fair. That's fair. Yes.
What time is it?
It is
Time
4:20.
Whoa. It's 4:20.
It is 4:20. All right. So, action over exposition is our next point. With that being said, with short stories in particular, you don't want a lot of info dumping. You don't want a lot of, and here's her whole backstory about how she grew up
Wow.
tragically. You want action. You
Yeah.
want
You
the
wanna
story
tell that
to be
through
moving
the
forward.
story.
Exactly. Tell it through the story.
Unless you're a different person, you just tell it through dialogue.
I know.
That's
right?
true. Or tell it through dialogue, but that's still telling it through the story because it's
True.
action.
Yeah, because he does tell like.
Like
it-
now, for my most
Yes.
scarring tragic backstory.
Oh, how did you get that scar? Well, my mother gave it to me when she found me in the barn with the bulls and we all were wrestling.
There you go. Exactly. See, that's a great action because it's dialogue, therefore it's action. So dialogue counts as action, movement counts as action. This is why action tags are so important in short stories. Why? Because he said that's going to take up 2 words that you don't really need. However, if you say he glared at her like he was going to kill her,
Or
that's
fire
going
in
to
his
give
eyes
yes,
instead
sorry.
of it all.
Exactly.
That's
That
what it is,
helps
though.
give action. Or if he's like fiddling with a knife in his hands, you're like, I'm worried.
It's like,
Oh wait, red knife. It's like, oh, I'll just cut tomatoes, you know.
Yes, I'm cutting tomatoes. That's what all this red stuff in my hands is. So, yeah, with action, that's why action tags are much superior in short stories. In novels, it's okay to do a couple he said, she said. But in short stories, action tags are key because it helps move the story forward, even in your dialogue tag. Yes?
Oh, I was just gonna ask if like dialogue you can tell stuff
Mhm.
easily instead of trying to show it. Does that work in letters as well?
Yes and no. With short stories, I would say try not to lean too heavily on letters, purely because letters generally are back and forth, and so it's going to take up a lot of word count. Meanwhile, with dialogue, yes, so long as it doesn't sound like Maiden Butler dialogue. Now, I think we've discussed Maiden Butler dialogue before, but I'm going to recap just for the video. Maiden Butler dialogue is things when the butler comes in and says, as you know, what so-and-so wants his Pomeranian washed by 10 o'clock. And the maid says, of course, and you know he wants his tea. They already know these things, so why are they saying them? So you don't want your dialogue to sound like that. But if it is belying information without doing that, then by all means go for it. If she's like, I can't believe you forgot to wash the Pomeranian, that's different. That's going to give more action to it and going to feel different and give you information without feeling stilted and forced. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes.
What happens if what do you do if the short story is told in letters?
You can totally do that. You can totally do a short story told in letters. Just know it might be a little harder, purely because it's going to take up a lot of word count really quick. So you're going to want to make sure those letters are packed to the brim with information. And they aren't like, oh yes, by the way, I saw a dog on a walk the other day. Like, you don't want to say that.
The dog was
Why?
carrying secret information to the enemy lines.
Yes, that's the main reason why letters are hard, because when writing a genuine letter, that stuff tends to be told, right? When I write a letter to my cousins who live in other states, I'll sometimes say things like that. Like, oh yeah, I saw the cutest cat in my neighborhood the other day. But in a short story, if you're telling it through letters, you want to make sure that you leave that stuff out. You just keep it packed with the actual information you need.
Very blunt.
Yes, be blunt. Get to the point and smack it. All right.
And then scream in pain because the point hurt your hand.
Because the point.
It's pointing.
That's great. All right. So, any other questions? We've technically reached the end of our lesson, so you can ask any questions you like about short stories and struggles you have with them or things you're worried about. Oh, I forgot to mention flashbacks. I have something in my notes, but I was rushing through it. Flashbacks and dreams in short stories. Generally, unless it's important to the plot, no. The reason I say that is because of the fact that it gets too confusing for the reader. However, if you do a dream sequence, just make sure that it's very clearly a dream sequence and make sure that it doesn't take up too much time. That's another thing with plot that you want to be careful of. With a short story, you don't want to make it take place over a month or weeks. You want to make sure it's a couple days. And that if you skip a week or something like that, you only skip a week once. If you start skipping several weeks, it starts feeling like a novel being told in a short story, and it's awkward. And if you're doing flashbacks, make sure that the flashbacks are only relevant. And if they are relevant, make sure it's clear it's a flashback. Because if it's not clear it's a flashback, we get very, very confused as readers, and then we're just like, where is past? Where is present? Who am I? And that hurts.
And then you ascend to the heavens and turn into the sun.
Yep, so it's rough. So if you're going to do flashbacks, just make sure that you make it very clear that it's a flashback. And especially in a short story. In a novel, you can kind of get away with like having 3 stars at the beginning and 3 stars at the end, and someone's like, oh, this is clearly a delineation of time. Whereas with a short story, you probably want to say 9 days earlier and be very blunt. Just hit them over the head with it. This is 9 days earlier, just in case you missed it. And then dream sequences, make sure it's very bluntly a dream sequence. Like, make it obvious either from showing or telling. Either say, and she was dreaming, tell, or show it by being like, and JoJo is now a moose.
Why is JoJo? Oh, it's like
Exactly. Why is JoJo a moose? Because it's a dream. That makes more sense.
Kind of fairy, whatever.
Yeah, unless it's some sort of fey craziness. In which case, you want to delineate it's a dream, because otherwise, no one's going to know the difference.
She's in a dream. Wait, no, she's not.
So yeah,
What?
make sure that your short stories take place over a short amount of time, and there are a few time skips, and that flashbacks and dreams are kept to only what's necessary.
Unless the whole
Unless the whole story is a dream. Yes.
And
that-
then and then at the end they're about to die and then they wake up and they're like,
I need.
what?
Gasp.
I heard someone who said if Harry Potter had ended that way, they would have been
Oh
so
gosh,
mad.
me too. I would have been so mad. All right.
I would have laughed.
Anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, I'd be like, woke up
Please, ask
still
as many
alive
questions
under
as you
the
want.
stairs. What?
I was trying to say if you have any more other questions about short stories or things you're worried about.
Can I just make my short stories just very blunt?
Define very blunt because we do want to show not tell. But
There was a person
Never
of
mind.
indeterminate gender and age. That's what we need to do
All
with
right.
the history portion.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna wrap up the video then, and then we can discuss whatever you guys want about short stories. And I will go downstairs, and for those of you who submitted short stories, I'm gonna grab your short story feedback. Okay?
Oh, wait, so who won?
It was technically Zachary Gray, even though he's not here today, and it was by like 9 points. You were second place by
Wait.
9 points.
Wait. What
So
place was I in?
fourth. I'm sorry.
Checks out.
It was fourth, but that's mainly because of the flashbacks being very confusing, and so several people didn't know what was happening.
I've never
it
had
was
my work
we can talk about it
done
later.
before.
All right.
Unless I like shove it in their face and make them